The year 2022 marked the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 17 mission, which means it's been half a century since humans last landed on the moon. NASA formally launched its Artemis program in 2017, not only to take back astronauts to the moon, but also to build a lunar South Pole base and establish a permanent presence. We haven't visited the lunar surface for more than 50 years now, and it's high time to set our foot on our nearest celestial neighbor, especially considering all the technological advancements that we have today. But why haven't we visited the moon ever since the 1970s? With all the technology that we have today, it's strange for NASA to not attempt another crewed lunar exploration mission, right? Well, there's a lot more to it, so keep watching till the end to know more about the Artemis 1 mission and its significance. In July 1969, humans first landed on the moon as part of the Apollo 11 mission, which is still a major milestone in human history. But ever since 1972, we have never visited the moon, and for so many reasons. The race to land humans on the moon was kick-started by President John F. Kennedy's 1962 speech at Rice Stadium in Houston, Texas. That speech is now known as the Go to the Moon speech, and the president committed to getting a human to walk on the moon by the end of the decade. President John F. Kennedy said, "This will be done in the decade of the 60s. It may be done while some of you are still here at school at this college and university. It will be done during the term of office of some of the people who sit here on this platform. But it will be done. And it will be done before the end of this decade." Surprisingly, when the moon landing took place in 1969, Kennedy's goal was achieved and his deadline was successfully fulfilled. Apollo 11 was followed by 6 further trips to the moon, 5 of which landed successfully. But after achieving the goal, NASA had to face several large funding cuts, making the future Apollo missions impossible. NASA originally had 20 Apollo missions planned, but the technological and research-based missions were not seen as important as the moon landing itself, because of which the final 3 missions were canceled. The US government was willing to put a lot of money into the Apollo missions only because it helped them win the space race, because of which the research and technological developments part of the program was not viewed as a priority. So the Apollo 11 mission was more of a political statement than uncovering the mysteries of the moon. Once NASA was successful in putting a human on the moon, the necessity for more missions to the moon did not have any political advantages. Going to the moon in itself was extremely expensive. Originally, Kennedy's government had an estimated budget of $7 billion, and towards the end of the total cost was about $20 billion. There was very little national support because of all the Apollo missions had taken place against the backdrop of civil unrest in the United States, and the large amounts of money being spent on space travel became a point of contention for the general American public. Once the Cold War was beginning to settle, the strategic arms limitations talks meant that the missile production, including those used for space travel, was drastically reduced. But things are now changing with the Artemis Mission 1. We are finally going to put humans, once again, onto the lunar surface. The primary goal for Artemis 1 is to demonstrate Orion System's spaceflight environment, and also to ensure a safe, free entry, descent, splashdown, and recovery prior to the very first flight with the crew on the Artemis 2. The Artemis 1, for those of you who don't know, will be the very first in a series of increasingly complex missions to build a long-term human presence on the lunar surface for the decades to come. Artemis mission will be responsible for putting the very first woman and the very first person of color on the southern pole of the lunar surface, and to lay the groundwork for sending astronauts to Mars in the future, most probably by setting up a lunar base. 3 Artemis missions are currently in progress. Artemis 1's mission includes the uncrewed test flight, which will circle and fly over Passmore. Artemis 2 will be a crewed flight beyond the moon, which will take humans further than they have been in space. And finally, we have the Artemis 3, which will land the very first female astronaut and the first astronaut of color on the moon. These astronauts will be spending a week performing scientific studies on the lunar surface. Artemis 3 will be the U.S. Space Agency's very first crewed landing mission ever since the Apollo 17 in 1972. The Artemis 1 liftoff also marked the debut of the Space Launch System, which is, by far, the most powerful rocket ever built, as it generates 8.8 million pounds of thrust, making it 1.3 million pounds more powerful than the Saturn V rocket used in the Apollo missions. Artemis 1 has humble mission objectives. It is technically only a lunar orbiter mission without carrying any astronauts. It does not even have a lander or a rover component. The mission spacecraft, known as Orion, will get to the lunar orbit that would be about 97 kilometers or 60 miles from the moon's surface. But, unlike most other orbiter missions, Orion has a return to Earth target after it has orbited the moon for about 30 days. But is NASA trying to reinvent the wheel with this mission? Well, the objective of this mission is to ensure the return of human beings to the moon, and that's where the similarities end between the Apollo mission and the Artemis mission. The Artemis missions are going to be qualitatively different from Apollo missions. The moon landings of the 1960s and 1970s, as those landings were a little too early in the space age. Apollo missions were guided by geopolitical considerations and the desire of the United States to go win the space race, defeating the Soviet Union, which had taken a considerable lead in space technology by sending the very first satellite into space, the very first spacecraft to crash on the lunar surface, and the very first astronaut in space. The Artemis missions are in a position to exploit the major advancements in space. These missions will now make it possible to start extracting resources that are found on the moon, build things from the materials available there, and harness hydrogen or helium as an energy source. So this time, the human landing on the moon will be much more meaningful than earlier, because now we have a common goal, which crosses all geographic barriers. The Artemis mission is all about laying the foundations for more complex and ambitious missions. It is getting several payloads in the form of small satellites called CubeSats, each of which is equipped with instruments meant for specific investigations and experiments. The focus of these investigations is to explore long-term stays of human beings in space. The other satellite will search for water in all its forms. Another will map the availability of hydrogen that can be utilized as a source of energy. There will be biological experiments investigating the behavior of small organisms like fungi and algae in outer space and the effect of radiation, especially the reaction of the genes. The Orion spacecraft is specifically designed to carry astronauts into deep space on future missions, and this time it was equipped with 3 dummy passenger mannequins made of material that mimic human bones, skin, and soft tissue, with a host of sensors to record various impacts of deep space atmosphere on the human body. The rocket that's being used for the Artemis missions is called the Space Launch System, and it is by far the most powerful ever built, more powerful than Saturn V rockets that were used for the Apollo missions. The giant 98-meter-tall rocket, which weighs about 2,500 tons, can help the Orion spacecraft. NASA already launched its uncrewed Artemis 1 on November 16th on top of the Space Launch System, which is now the world's most powerful rocket. The Orion will fly a 25-day trip to the moon and will return to Earth on December 11th, 2022. There's no doubt about the fact that the Apollo 11 moon landing in July 1969 was a huge achievement for human beings as a whole, along with the advancements in engineering. This was the moment the entire world was waiting for. Apollo 11 was then followed by 6 further trips to the moon, 5 of which landed successfully, which means about 12 men walked onto the lunar surface in total. In 1977, future Apollo missions were canceled, which means Apollo 17 became the last manned mission to the moon for an indefinite amount of time. Artemis 1 is the beginning of a new space age, and NASA's long-term goals are even more ambitious. With all the technology and research developed during the Artemis mission, NASA will be launching a future crewed mission to Mars, which aligns with the goal of SpaceX, which is to colonize Mars, making humans a multi-planetary species. This Moon to Mars plan will involve building a new space station in the lunar orbit and eventually a habitable moon base. If the Artemis 1 goes well, NASA will be free to start setting themselves up for Artemis 2, which would send astronauts around the moon in 2024. In 2025, the agency plans to launch the Artemis 3 to put humans onto the lunar South Pole, the site of the envisioned research base. It's exciting to see the space agency once again getting people onto the lunar surface for scientific discovery and economic benefits, while also inspiring a whole new generation of explorers called the Artemis generation.